study of the second book of Samuel, we're now commencing chapter 3 and looking in particular at the first 5 verses. Abner, the leader of the deceased Saul's army, and Joab, perhaps a self-appointed leader of David's army, had reached a truce between them and have each gone back to their kings. Abner to Ishbosheth, Saul's surviving son, and Joab to David. Although Joab, we believe, still harbored a feeling of revenge towards Abner. More to come on that later. I'm Ken Godevanis, and this is Digging for Scriptural Gems. Verse 1 tells us that although there was a temporary truce, the war was indeed prolonged between these two houses. However, it reports that David's side grew steadily stronger, while Ishbosheth's side grew weaker. The next 4 verses telling us about David's sons, born to him in Hebron, are much more interesting than their face content suggests. These sons were, and bear with me, number 1, Ammon. Ammon's mother was Ahinoam the Jezreelitess. Number 2, Chilbiah. His mother was Abigail, the widow of Nabal the Carmelite. Number 3, Absalom. His mother was Maacah, the daughter of Talmai, the king of Geshur. Number 4, Adonijah. His mother was Haggith. And number 5, Shephatiah. His mother was Abital. And then finally, number 6, Ithream. His mother was Iglah, which the text actually calls David's wife, which therefore causes some to think was Michal. Michal, you'll remember her from before, his first and most rightful wife, called here by another name, and though she had no child after she mocked David, she might have had one before, and this may have been it. So 7 years in Hebron's 6 sons, and that excludes any records of any daughters he may have had during this time. Chuck Smith points out that this is an indication of David starting to portray a weakness that later led to his widely and unfavorably known sin with Bathsheba. He began to add wives and concubines. His son Solomon later on carries this idea of multiple wives to a ridiculous extreme, but let us not forget that David started it all with his own behavior. Now, why was this so bad? Well, if you remember back in Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 17, God stipulated as a commandment that kings were not to have multiple wives. And God had his good reason for that. That is, that the king would not turn his heart away from God. If he did have multiple wives, that would lead him to forget God. But it wasn't just a commandment in Deuteronomy that David was disobeying. He was going against God's very heart and intention for marriage. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 24, God stipulates that a single man shall cleave to a single wife, and they will become one flesh. And in the New Testament, Jesus repeats that intention in Matthew chapter 19, verses 4 to 6, adding that no man shall separate the two who have been joined together. Now, we must remember that David wasn't doing anything unusual for his time. Men did, in fact, in those days show their importance and wealth or exhibit it by having many wives and concubines. It is just that God didn't approve of it. And that is exactly what many do today. We excuse behavior that God doesn't approve of because it is so prevalent in our society, making us think that it is acceptable. And God really didn't have life today in mind when he made his views known. What a mistake that is. And here's why. According to David Gusick, it was a mistake in the case of David. Number 1, one son, Amnon, raped his half-sister and was murdered by his half-brother. We'll hear more about this later on in 2 Samuel. The second son, Chileab, is also known as Daniel in 1 Chronicles 3:1. The few mentions of this son indicate that perhaps he died young or that he was ungodly, unworthy man, according to Gusick. We don't know. Bishop Patrick mentions the reason for the 2 names. His first name was Daniel, which means God has judged me, namely against Nabal. But David's enemies reproached him and said, it is Nabal's son and not David's. So as he grew up, this young man became, in his countenance and features, extremely like David, and resembled him more than any of his children, upon which David decided to give him the name of Chileab, which signifies like his father, or the father's picture. Number 3 son, Absalom, murdered his half-brother and led a civil war against his father David, attempting to murder David. We'll see this later on. Absalom's mother is said to be the daughter of Talmai, king of Geshur, as we mentioned earlier. He was a heathen prince, and perhaps David thereby hoped to strengthen his interest against Ishbosheth's side, but the issue of marriage was one that proved his grief and shame in the end. Number 4, Adonijah tried to seize the throne from David and David's appointed successor. Then he tried to take one of David's concubines and was executed for his arrogance. Still to come for us. Or that story is still to come for us. And number 5, we can fairly assume, says Gusick, that number 5 and 6 son, Shephatiah and Ithream, either died young or were ungodly and unworthy men, because they are mentioned only once again in the scriptures in a generic listing of David's son, 1 Chronicles chapter 3, verses 1 to 4, which we referred to earlier. Clearly, David's ungodly romantic actions in Hebron had their consequences. What then can we reap from the passage? Well, once again, God's commands for us are proven to be what is best for mankind. Individually and collectively, we ignore them at our own peril. Today, I woke up to the news that the American vice president has gone public with a statement that says something to this effect: nothing about abortion requires anyone to abandon or change their faith. Wow. And she says she arrived at this conclusion after consulting several faith leaders of today. Well, maybe she should have inquired of God, and maybe she should have consulted her Bible if she has one. The best response to her statements, and there were many, but one came from a female constitutional law attorney called Jenna Ellis, who said, quote, "The elites now want to tell you what the God they don't believe in requires of you, just to promote their disgusting political agenda," end of quote. Friends, do not be deceived. God has spoken on the matter of abortion. He's spoken on the matter of marriage. Man cannot change that. Not David, not Kamala Harris, not you, and certainly not me. Next time, we'll see how a concubine causes a major row and change of loyalty in the house of Saul. Join us for that. In the meantime, I would ask you to again consider subscribing to our YouTube channel. That would please me greatly, and I know it would be a great encouragement to us. If you haven't done so, please do so, and please share these studies with others. Send us your comments, and keep on digging for scriptural gems.